pointed out, diverse, heterogeneous population. How do we reach out to them? How do we define inclusiveness? Whether it should be relevant to this section and whether it resonates with the aspirations and demands and desires of the people. So we cannot take a very high moral ground that we are the ones who decide. We cannot also be taking this kind of a position that, there are a certain set of people who think this is the best for the country. Actually, we may be right, but we may not always be right. That is the bottom line.
So what I'm understanding is that probably like any government of the world, emerging economy government have huge challenges, and we need to really provide the thought leadership, and we have to bring people, all the stakeholders together, be really transparent to do a good job of enactment. I will have one more question, and then I will invite questions from floor. So India has many good policies, and we have not so good policy, okay? So what is the cost actually of not having a good policy? Is it only economic? Is it only time? Is it only what? I mean, some discussion on that, and then I will invite questions from floor. Whoever wants to go first.
Tabrez, it's very difficult to actually comment on this question for various reasons. But you cannot actually at that particular moment decide whether it is good or bad. Because when you are making a policy, some people are likely to be disgruntled and would say immediately at that moment itself that this policy is bad. But while forming policy, you are looking at greater good or common good. And whatever consideration the policymaker has at that time, according to them, it would be the best way to move forward. And we have various examples, and in this country itself, where good policies at that time may not have looked very good in the mind of some few people, but then turned out to be very good. Okay, so from that perspective, I feel that you cannot quantify the loss immediately. It is what you call as a trial and error method. Policy making actually is trial and error because the data is empirical, and you can at only later point of time figure out what was wrong with that policy and maybe make improvements. And this is how basically policy making works. In terms of the loss, I think at times in economic environment you can quantify the losses. Sometimes we have seen recent past certain government offices have. In fact, the independent CAG has commented on the losses that have incurred because of wrong policies followed. But the point is that you can still question the methodology of following that particular quantification of the losses. That's number one. And number two, you can never quantify what is the social loss that is going to happen. And we have seen that in light of, or at the time when certain amendments were being envisaged for information technology law. And I know that information technology law has been in place for a long time, but it recently went like major amendments. And the issues that people have been talking about for years were only addressed much later. And like, for example, child pornography, or things which relate to cyber stalking or cyber theft and all. Now, you can never quantify the social loss that we would have incurred because we delayed that policy making or that regulation making in that area.
No, so maybe, yeah, sorry. So I fully agree with what Ranjan said, but then also I'd like to submit for the thought process of the panelists and the audience is that probably in a country like India, which is growing very, very rapidly, at times we ourselves are very, very surprised. So even the growth projections have gone haywire in the industry that me and Anwar belong to. Nobody could have, even projected around a year ago that of all the form factors, electronic form factors, the tablets are going to be witnessing such a huge growth. Nobody had ever predicted, and the growth projections went, ORI by almost what, 200%? 400%. So there you are. So probably what we need to think about is to create some kind of a framework, which I'm referring to time and again, which, if not eliminate any bad policy, at least mitigate the chances of having a bad policy. Plus, there will be learnings till we are dynamic enough to accept those learnings, till we are nimble-footed enough to bring in those changes. Problem is that, probably the policy-making process is also fairly slow. Currently, there are no benchmarks, there are no time frames, there are no milestones actually to analyze whether a policy is good, bad, or what is happening. So if we can bring in those kind of systematic changes, probably we can mitigate chances of a bad policy, if not completely eliminate.
So partly yes, partly Bikas addressed whatever, because I was wanting to refer to the electronics sector, and he quite rightly said. What happens is, with my limited experience, I've seen that many of the policies which were created in electronics sector are very good policies. The issue has been the implementation of those policies, and the implementation has been a very, very large cost to the industry and the other stakeholders. The question is that how quick are we in terms of revising it? How fast can we change it and move forward? And that's a challenge that we see in terms of policy making.
Well, actually, one of the consequences of bad policy is what Justice Singh was saying in the morning. The Supreme Court judges have to work overtime. So that's one consequence of bad policy, I suppose. But apart from economic implications like the Vodafone case or etc., I think another impact which is often an undesirable consequence of that policy, which it becomes therefore makes the policy bad, is the market distortions that it can create. And again, I come back to an example from one of my liquor industry days. Now, for example, if you see India, India for some strange reason, almost 100 years ago, beer did not exist as a category. It was only spirits. So they adopted a policy regime which was really that tax will be based on volume. So basically all taxation was per liter, and that's what most of the states followed. So when beer came into the market, it continued to have the same taxation, which is per liter. But now the problem is that in 1 liter of whiskey, you have 40% alcohol, and in 1 liter of beer, you have 5 to 8% alcohol. So now you were charging the same duty on 1 liter of beer as you were on 1 liter of whiskey. So it obviously meant that the beer prices were disproportionately higher than a bottle of whiskey. And this led to a situation where India is the only country in the world where spirits by volume sell more than beer. Otherwise, in almost every other country where there's both spirits and beer, beer far outsells spirits. Now, I'm not saying I'm not batting for one or the other. Of course, I used to bat for beer because I used to be in a beer company. But basically, it is a distortion of the market, and which is not necessarily a desirable distortion, because then you have a whole generation or a couple of generations of people who are hooked onto hard liquor, as opposed to a product like beer. And also, beer has huge benefits in terms of social benefits, in terms of the farmers and so on and so forth. Now, a country like China realized this in 1993. Because they found that with increasing economic progress, the consumption of what is called, in India we call IMFL, but the Western spirits, was climbing in India, in China. And they actually took a decision one fine day, literally like that, because they can, and said, we will tax according to alcohol, which is what most of the world does. You basically tax the alcohol in that bottle. After that, whether you want to sell 100% alcohol, you want to spend 2% alcohol, that's up to you. Which is why you find that in most parts of the world, beer is 3% alcohol and 4% alcohol. So China actually did this. It meant that they suffered in terms of revenue for a year or two, but it did mean that suddenly, you were able to, and similarly Russia, because they again found with increasing prosperity, people were just drinking vodka, and it wasn't necessarily a great thing for people's livers. So they also took an umbilical decision like that. But unfortunately, in a country like India, where of course what complicates it further is a state subject. So each state has to take that decision. And then you obviously have players, and as somebody mentioned in the morning panel, once you give somebody something, you can't really take it away from them. So that's another, so they can distort markets if you have bad policies.
I would just add that rather than using the word cost-benefit analysis to judge a policy, I think in the current state it's more to do with trade-offs. So say, for instance, if we have a mining policy which enables growth, which leads to higher productivity, but on the other hand, it is also very damaging for the environment. These are the trade-offs, these are the decisions which you need to take. So say, for instance, when Supreme Court bans mining in Goa, it is clearly saying that we are prepared to sacrifice productivity, efficiency, growth for the sake of environment. So at this point, I would say policy depends upon the flavor of the guiding philosophy of the country. So there was an era when socialism prevailed in 70s and 60s where all policies were geared towards a very socialistic bent of mind. Today we have market-driven policies. 20 years later, we don't know what kind of policies will prevail. So essentially, where I'm coming from is the fact that we need to give a time span to a policy and then see whether it is relevant or not.
So thanks a lot. So I have exhausted my question, whatever I had in mind, but I know on the floor I see students, I see our guest from abroad, I see a lot of litigating lawyers and business representation. So I open the floor now for question to panelists. Please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask questions. Can we have mics, please? Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Pranav Mehra, Managing Editor, Conspicuous Competition. Mr. Sundeep Kumar talked about market distortion being a side effect of a bad policy. My question to you, sir, is can't we emulate these distortions on a virtual model before we implement? Or do you think we should have an economic analysis of policy before it's implemented in India?
Yeah, we definitely should. And that's what I meant earlier when I talked about greater professionalism that needs to come into this sector. I don't think we often do these kind of modelings and so on and so forth. And the example that I gave you of the alcohol, I'm sure at no point in time when beer was introduced, somebody sat down and said, okay, now what's going to be the consequence of doing this for the next 20 years? And by the time there was a beer association and the beer association went and said all these things, it was too late. It was too late to the extent, it's not too late, it's never too late, but it's too late to the extent that there is already a policy in place. There are enough people benefiting out of that policy. Those people have greater influence on that policy making in different ways. And consequently, changing that policy becomes a Herculean task until somebody somewhere sits down and says it should be done. But I remember we had a meeting with Mr. Chidambaram at that point in time. And literally he said, I'm sorry, I've got 300 priorities and this is not even in there, which is fact because it's a state subject. He said there's nothing really I can do. Even if I agree with you, I can't go to 35 states and union territories and tell them to change their policies.
And not just a state subject, I mean, since I also have briefly worked in beer industry, it's interesting to note that the excise laws that exist in Delhi as on date were called the Punjab excise.
Punjab, Chandigarh and
Haryana, Haryana was not even created, and it is a pre-independence era excise policy that is still
1904.
1904.
Punjab Delhi Excise Act. That's what happened. And one of the things it says is that you have to close your brewery at 6 p.m.
At 6 p.m. Yes.
At sunset.
Yeah, James, go ahead.
I have a couple of observations that I'd like to share with you. First, I found this incredibly interesting. When I was a young lawyer, I was counsel and staff director to a fairly important U.S. Senate committee, and I see a lot of similarities between some of the things you're talking about and some of the things we did, and there were also some differences. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But the first thing I think we all need to keep in mind is that in a truly functioning democracy, you're free to make mistakes. And you will. And the problem is not making mistakes. The problem is not realizing that you made a mistake and correcting it. Now, in the process that has evolved over more than 200 years in the United States, the policy-making process is really divided into two phases. The first phase is investigatory. And during that phase, the idea is not to make decisions about what we're going to do. It's to make decisions about what is the problem, what are the parameters of the problem. And in that process, everyone is entitled to petition the government. That's a critical rule in the United States. Everyone, regardless of what their interest is, regardless of what their point of view is, they're free to express that. And the idea is that if you get a broad cross-section of ideas and viewpoints, and then good people who can synthesize that, you come up with a report as to what are the problems and what are the parameters of those problems. Then you go into the second phase, and that's the legislative phase, where people try to establish laws that address the problems in some rational way. And again, you can have all the stakeholders participate in that process. And they try to keep it as transparent as possible, because the hearings are open to the public. There are reports published that are available now on the internet, previously in printed form, which were widely disseminated so people could discuss them and talk about them. And then periodically, you're just going to have to revisit these things. Things change. And when they do change, the policy may also have to change. Sometimes the policy is still good, but you may not be able to make that without revisiting the entire process again. You may not go into it in quite the same level of depth, but you may have to engage in that same process. Investigate again. Does this policy still make sense? Is it still consistent and realistic with the conditions as they now are? And maybe revise the process. And then I'll repeat the thing that I started off with. You are going to make mistakes. The problem is not recognizing it and not correcting it.